then to pursuing a PhD in history. And what I wanted to talk a little bit about today is about history and sort of the discipline, and in particular, the story of history as a discipline, as a way of thinking, the story of modern, like the modern story of history in South Asia, right? So I guess we can begin with just even the meaning of history. What does the word history actually even mean, right? So this word history actually comes from a Greek word, historia, which actually literally means investigation or inquiry, right? And it would be interesting to think about the origins of the Arabic word tarikh, because this is the word that's used in Pakistan and, you know, in much of sort of Urdu speaking contexts. But it's interesting to think about this, because I'm also curious as to where and how that term came out of, because the ways in which history was practiced in the pre-modern, what we call the pre-modern South Asia, right? Basically, I mean, before the 17th, 18th century, right? I mean, of course, historians debate all the time what is modern, what is pre-modern. But there was very different and dynamic approaches to the study of history. However, if we think about the ways in what we have inherited now in India, in Pakistan, you know, we have inherited sort of the modern discipline of history, right? And I think key here are two processes over the span of the basically from the 18th century onwards, two processes that are really important and that are part of the story of the modern discipline of history, which is the processes of colonialism, British colonialism, and nationalism. So whether that was Indian nationalism, Pakistani nationalism, right? So these two processes, colonialism and nationalism, played a very central role in determining the kinds of narratives that have become almost part of common sense in India and Pakistan, right? And if we don't go back and interrogate where these narratives and where these modern kind of discipline of history comes from, then we miss out a lot, you know? And so I'd like to begin there. One of the sort of, you know, when we think about sort of the modern, when we think of the modern discipline of history, and so I'm not sort of here thinking about those chronicles, for example, that were written in Akbar's courts, or many chronicles. I mean, you see, for example, Muhammad Qasim Farishta, who was a very famous historian and chronicler. He was based in the Deccan Sultanates, right? So there are like these dynamic sort of figures writing about the past, writing about the series of kings and dynasts and so on and so forth, right, over the centuries. And they had a very different approach to writing about the past, but the past was important to them. And every society has a sense of the past. Every society has had a sense of, you know, what came before, right? That is universal. Now, when we think about the modern discipline of history, though, the kind of history we might learn about, say, like in Pakistan studies, right, which is a core part of the curriculum there, or the kind of history that is taught in India in the schools, right? So that is kind of implicated. If we look at those textbooks and much of what went into kind of some of the common sense of those textbooks, right, that comes out of the modern discipline of history, the modern period. And there was a particular kinds of assumptions. So when the British arrived to India, in the 18th century, they brought with them certain assumptions about India, right? About this place that they were beginning to conquer. And I think this is a key here. This is a key point, because although we have a lot of records and a lot of materials that was classified and categorized in ways that that were not organized in the same way before. And we found a lot of sort of interesting archaeological kinds of researches that happened under the British. There's lots of interesting things that happened, but at the same time, the narrative of how South Asians, and at that time, the British, it's really sort of India, right? Because before that, this place was not called India. Before the British got to South Asia, it was not called India. It went by many names. It went by Hindustan, Al-Hind, and so on. So I think this is important, and I think we can begin perhaps with some of the mythologies and the myths that were perpetuated by British colonial officials, and by sort of the ways in which they were producing knowledge about a place that they didn't know very much about. So they're coming to some place, for them, a lot of things seem disordered and unorganized, right? Not because there was disorder, but because of their perspectives that they were bringing, a kind of Judeo-Christian civilization at the turn of the Enlightenment, and the ways in which they were perceiving the peoples of the subcontinent. And again, sort of, I think here, perhaps one way to begin is to think about, for example, scholars. And these were, when we use the word Orientalist, right? Sort of one definition of Orientalist, the basic definition would be the European scholars who made the study of the East, quote unquote, the East, their career. That was what they did, right? So, you have figures like Sir William Jones in the 18th century, who, they learned languages like Sanskrit, Arabic, and Persian. And they sort of developed new ideas around the linkages between these languages. And, I think they were also trying to see a glimpse of themselves in India, in sort of ancient civilizations, and so on and so forth. But the knowledge they produced was not objective or innocent, right? It was being produced within a particular context of conquest, right? And I think that, they were trying to understand India in a way that, so that they could develop sort of better ways to control and govern India, right? And so that led to particular kinds of real sort of epistemological change. What we mean by epistemology, just a fancy word for saying, like, not how knowledge is organized. So one of the first things that you see is this way of understanding the past, right? And what you see by the 19th century, and you can see this in the work of James Stuart Mill, who, well, he's known in the West as a philosopher. He was also someone who wrote about the history of India. So the very first works in English, so the very first works in English of the history of India, he wrote this several volumes of a book called The Peoples of India. And there were two key components of this view, of this way of understanding India. One was the periodization. Like, how do we think of chronology in periods, right? So for example, if we think of South Asian history divided into like an ancient period, and then medieval period, and modern period, like just very roughly, if we think of it that way, well, that was not the way the British thought of Indian history, or what we now call South Asian history. They thought of it as there was a Hindu period, there was a Muslim period, and then there was a British period. Now, as you can imagine, this way of understanding history is very problematic, because it sees the regions not as chronologically being mapped onto sort of religious identity, right? And sort of a kind of religious sort of a way of understanding that there's a Hindu period, Muslim period, as if during the Muslim period there are no Hindus, as if, right? So this kind of schema is a problem, right? And has been very much questioned by historians of South Asia, and has been really challenged, right? And has now been debunked. Now, the other and there are several kind of myths that went along with this approach to history of South Asia, right? Another was that there was a sense that there was a civilizational hierarchy, right? That there was somehow this order of civilizations. So I'll just read to you a quote from a review of James Stuart Mill's book Peoples of India, right? So the reviewers in 1818 say the following, that Mr. Mill has proved by incontrovertible evidence that the Hindus, though superior to the savage tribes of America and Africa, are far removed from the civilization of modern Europe, or even of Europe as it existed in the Middle Ages, that they should be ranked on nearly the same level with the Chaldegans, the Assyrians, the Egyptians of antiquity, that they are not superior to the present inhabitants of Bhutan, China, Cochin China, Siam, or Pegu, and that there never was a time when they were more civilized than they are today. So this attitude of ranking civilizations as inherently sort of lower or higher on some schema, with the British at the most high, right? Also produced a kind of vision of history that had to do with like a very linear development about, kind of civilizational sort of zenith, right? So that was another thing. And then when it comes particularly to Islam in South Asia, there were a few other things that went along with this, right? Now, when the British arrived in the 17, and they arrive at a moment when the Mughal empire is fragmenting. I would not say that it's a wholesale decline, because it was really something like between decline and decentralization. What you see in the north of, in the Mughal sort of centers, right? Like Delhi, like at the center kind of the state apparatus, is definitely a decline. Like the fortunes of nobles in Agra. As a wonderful poet, I'm thinking of this poet from Agra, Nazir, I think his name was Nazir Akbarabadi. And he wrote these beautiful poems, Sheher Ashok poems, about the declining fortunes of the nobles of the city in the north, right? As the Mughal empire pushed southwards under especially Aurangzeb, and the central Mughal apparatus became more decentralized, right? Sort of you begin to see lots of these different Mughal successor states, all sorts of people beginning to declare themselves Rajas and Nawabs and kings, independent kings, and so on and so forth, right? So, but there was also at this time enormous economic prosperity, in the 18th century. 18th century was not this period of chaos and anarchy. If you read some of these British historians, they describe the 18th century as a period of chaos, anarchy, but actually there's a lot of really rich economic, particularly in the coasts, like in Surat, and southern India, all along the coasts. I mean, it's precisely the riches, the wealth that was being transported all across the Indian Ocean world that drew the British, in fact, even earlier, other Europeans, to this part of the world, right? So at this moment, as Sir William Jones, James Stuart Mill, others are beginning to kind of think about how to understand Indian history, one of the other things that was said was that, oh yes, Indians don't really have a sense of the past. This is also something that was said, right? Of course, we know that no society is, all societies rather have a sense of the past. The other thing is, again, returning to this question of Islam in South Asia. So one of the other myths is that Muslims have been forever foreigners to South Asia. So this is a myth that comes out again out of sort of the colonial period, that somehow Muslims were outsiders. Now, this is, of course, this is really a problem, right? Because you see that there are Muslim communities settling in India as early as the 8th century. So, Islam in South Asia has been around almost as long as Islam has been around, almost 12 to 1300 years. So that's this myth that somehow Muslims are foreigners and not really kind of part of India is something, again, that was very much a part of the common sense of British historical writing. The second thing about Islam in South Asia in particular is that somehow Muslims were the worst and most tyrannical rulers. So you find this a lot also, and this is actually a theory that was held, the theory of Oriental despotism. Okay, so this theory that gained a lot of traction, especially in the 19th century in British historical writing, by a number of sort of liberal historical writing, is that somehow the Muslim rulers were Oriental despots. They were particularly cruel, particularly tyrannical, and that there had been this long period where they had taken over. They had, at one point of time, and this was sort of an Orientalist way of understanding the history, that at one point of time, the Hindus had their glorious civilization, then the Muslims came, they destroyed it, and they did it in a very tyrannical, venal, cruel way. Now we have to understand that this that is almost deliberate, actually, that kind of narrative in British historical writing, because see, how do you justify your presence in India? How do the British are justifying their presence in India? They are saying, we are the most enlightened rulers. We are bringing justice, equity, and good conscience to India, right? That was the big phrase: justice, equity, and good conscience to India. And so they sort of narrated this idea of, I mean, of course, definitely British superiority was a big part of this. I sense that they were superior to the peoples of India, but also that this idea that somehow it was Muslims in particular to blame, and that, this idea that, that somehow, I mean, it was a sense that if you could delegitimize the rulers right before you, that was one way you could legitimize your own rule. And this was actually part and parcel of the historical writing of South Asia, right? So you find this, that somehow Muslims are foreign, they came from outside. You find this a lot in narratives, nationalist narratives, then in India and in Pakistan, interestingly enough. And so there's a lot of that has continued into the present. Now, if we turn in particular to the arrival of Islam in the subcontinent, it's really fascinating. And I'm sure many of you already know this, but I mean, it arrived in three ways, right? Islam did not arrive in South Asia in a black box that just was fully, and just planted there. That's not how it happened. It's very complicated. So there was conquest, right? And conquest mostly from the north and northwest, right? So you had all sorts of, peoples from Central Asia, Turkic, Persian, many different groupings. And north and northwest India, of course, had already come under, they were all previous to these conquests of the Ghaznavids and then later others. They had always been, this region had always been, one where the geography of these invasions had occurred earlier, right? So that's one. It was not so much a break from the past, that these conquests did not signify something so radically new, departure from the past, in terms of how sovereignty and how difference was managed. The second way Islam came to South Asia, right? One through conquest. The second was conversion. And of course, conversion was not like a ready-made kind of immediate phenomenon, right? Like conversion happened very slowly and gradually over generations. So there's this wonderful historian by the name of Richard Eaton, and he talks about how, for example, if you look at Bengal and you see how, mothers would sing lullabies, the peasant mothers would sing lullabies to their children, and over time, these lullabies that were initially kind of using Hindu, gods and goddesses, begin to incorporate, the prophet, and begin to incorporate Islamic themes. And so this sort of is conversion is a gradual process. And of course, we are also aware of the enormous role played by Sufi silsilas, and the kind of devotional practices, the development of, Sufism was actually pretty key to the development even of regional, languages in South Asia, particularly in the 16th centuries, 16th and 17th centuries, where you had a lot of this devotional singing like bhajans. So the Hindu bhajans, of course, there would be a lot of similarity between them and the kind of poetry that you might hear in, for example, Qawwali. So, okay, so then there was conquest, there was conversion, and then there was trade. So that's the third route through which Islam came to South Asia, right? Was trade. Now, if you look at a map of India, you see that, or South Asia, you see India is like almost peninsular, surrounded almost on all sides by water. And water connected, we think that if we look at modern maps, and if we only look at sort of these landlocked nation states, what we miss out is that it's not that water separates us, but water actually connects us, right? And so there's this very vibrant political economy of the Indian Ocean world, and Arabs were traveling through trade to southern India even before Islam. Okay, so even pre-Islamic Arabs were traveling and trading on the southern Indian coasts. And there are these really rich connections. I teach a course on Indian Ocean history. And if you kind of look at these connections between different communities, what you'll see is that people in coastal regions have more in common with other people speaking different languages in coastal regions than they might have in those in their own sort of quote unquote territory in landlocked regions, or so I think these ways of understanding cultural difference and geography are also really important. So what you see is, interestingly enough, all sorts of different individuals are coming. You see in 8th century, if you go to Cochin, which is in South India, right, in Kerala, you'll see some of the earliest mosques that were built in South Asia, right? One of the problems, I think, with South Asian historiography, like basically historiography is another word that's a fancy word to basically mean the approaches to the writing of history, is that they have been dominated, particularly when we think about Islam in South Asia, they have been dominated by very north-centric north kind of, like that's the story that we are mostly concerned with. What is happening in northern India? What is now sort of this, Punjab, and, that is typically the way we think about, South Asian history, particularly Islam in South Asian history. But there are these incredible sort of diverse communities that come around mostly out of trade in southern India, not conquest, right? So if you only look at Islam in South Asia from a north-centric perspective, you're going to largely only be focused on this conquest and conversion narrative. But if you begin to sort of see, for instance, all sorts of communities in the south, you have there's a Jewish merchant by the name of Abraham bin Yiju, who is traveling in the 12th century to southern India. And he ends up marrying a local South Indian woman, and he leaves behind several records. He even has a slave, an Indian slave. And sort of you begin to sort of see actually all sorts of ways in which peoples were interacting. I mean, this is a Jewish merchant who was Arabic speaking, okay, had Indian slaves and Indian wife, and from the Nair, Brahmin Nair community in what is now Cochin, Kerala, and basically all along the Malabar coast, right? So there was all sorts of ways in which cultural difference was being negotiated and thought of, and religious difference was being accommodated, that really you don't see those kinds of, these really rich kinds of cultural exchange as not part of the British colonial narrative of South Asian history in the 19th and even into the 20th century, right? So I think those are key things to keep in mind. So even, for example, and then if you even think about religion, right, is that there are ways in which I mean, we know South Asia, there are communities from virtually every major religion in the world, from, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism. I mean, there's just like a really vibrant, rich, virtually every religion in the world has sort of history and communities in South Asia. So I think that is also really important to keep in mind. I think that national histories, when they begin to be written in these very, narrow ways, exclude all of the kind of pre-modern negotiations of cultural difference and religious accommodation that happened before. So, for example, I'll give you another story from the South, right? I don't know how many of you have heard of Malik Ambar. Has anyone heard of Malik Ambar? You have heard. He's basically he's from what is now Ethiopia, right? So the Deccan Sultanates, there's a whole number of Deccan Sultanates, they that are, Persian speaking. They are engaged in some kind of contest for control in southern and central India with each other and against the Vijayanagar Empire in southern India, right? So there's conquest from the north, but Vijayanagar Empire, 15th, 16th century is also pushing out from southern India to Sri Lanka to all the way to Indonesia, right? So we have to kind of think about these things in more holistic terms. So, I mean, you have Deccan Sultanates. I mean, there's so many. There's the Adil Shahis, Qutb Shahis. You have the, in Berar, Ahmednagar, you have these really Nizam Shahis, what is essentially these quote unquote Muslim, in the sense they're Muslim ruled, but they're Persian speaking. I mean, you see figures like who are speaking Persian, who use Persian in the courts, right? Whose dress is very much Dakkani, they're wearing saris in the style of the Vijayanagar Empire, if you look at these old paintings, who have many know Persian, but also local Indic languages. I'm researching right now on this queen, Chand Bibi Sultana, who was a queen in the Deccan, and she knew Persian, she knew Arabic, she knew Kannada, which is spoken in South India, she knew Marathi. Okay, so I mean, this is phenomenal. And so let me go back to the story of Malik Ambar, because it's another kind of interesting, from again a view from the South. Malik Ambar comes to India, via the slave trade. There's an Arab slave trade that's active between, India and Ethiopia, managed by many Arab traders. And because these Deccan Sultanates in the 1500s were fighting with one another quite a lot, there was a lot of contest and try to control for territory. So the slaves essentially from Ethiopia were brought in some ways. They were traded for textiles and goods like this, but this was a very different kind of slavery than, I mean, I tell my American students, because they think that all slavery that occurred is like American slavery. Actually, American slavery is plantation-based slavery. It's very different. This slavery was military slavery. And Malik Ambar came to India. I mean, his original name was Chapu, and then he was converted. Then he had this Arab name, Muslim name, and he originally was like served as a slave. And at that time, the slave master dynamic in the context of military slavery was one in which there was some kind of sense of both intimacy and superiority, right? So, these were seen as, I mean, if you read about this, you'll see how some of these, these sultanates, Deccan sultanates, men serving in them thought of their slaves. They said that a slave is more loyal than 1,000 sons. Right, so this idea of loyalty, that somehow these, what were called Habshis from Ethiopia would be more loyal because of the factional infighting, and they were coming, outside of that context. So many of them not only were educated and then rose in the military ranks, and some became slave dynasts themselves. So if you go to Aurangabad in India, Aurangabad is an incredible place actually, and you see the outside where the shrines, there are some Sufi dargahs next to the Aurangzeb's grave. Aurangzeb's grave is very simple. I've been to Aurangabad, it's quite fascinating. And Malik Ambar's tomb is there, as well as his wife's tombs, okay? He married local Indian women. So he became a king, and I mean, he became a local ruler in his own right and fought against the Mughals. When Jahangir was making, trying to go south, and there was a lot of this, attempts to control the Deccan and all, he actually rose and led his armies against the Mughals. And there's a wonderful painting, in fact, if you look it up, you can see that Jahangir is drawing his bow and arrow against the head of Malik Ambar, right? Sort of. So I mean, incredible, enormous diversity, a diffusion of culture. That again, if we just see this in terms of Hindu, Muslim, or India, Pakistan, these are all very modern categories of understanding the pre-modern past, in which there again was a lot of cultural accommodation of religious difference. I mean, I'm thinking also of as early as the 11th century, 10th and 11th century. How many of you have heard of Al-Biruni? You've heard of Al-Biruni, right? I mean, he's really quite a figure. He's really interesting in the sense that he comes to India. He's the first Muslim scholar. He's from Central Asia, okay? And he's coming in the, basically, he visits India in the year 1030. And 1030 AD, and these were really quite phenomenal sort of, I mean, Al-Biruni was a physicist, he was a sociologist, he was a geographer, he was a theologian rather. I mean, the way knowledge was organized in the pre-modern past, like knowledge, like what we call ilm, right? Ilm. It was not so cut and dry, divided in the ways we think of like science and art today as so distinct. Actually, there was a lot of interesting ways in which people's or those who are becoming educated peoples in the pre-modern past were thinking about knowledge. So he's the first Muslim scholar to actually study India, as well as the Brahmanical tradition. So he goes and he begins to try to get to a sense of understanding what is Hinduism from a Brahmin's perspective. He knows Persian, he knows Arabic, Sanskrit, and Latin. And he writes a book called Kitab Fi Tahqiq Malil Hind, which basically means the book of researches of India. And he visits India in 1030, and he says, quote, the Hindus believe with regard to God that he is one, eternal. That is what educated people believe about God. If we now pass from the ideas of the educated people to those of the common people, we must say that they present a great variety. Some of them are abominable, but similar errors also occur in other religions, unquote. So here you have Al-Biruni. He's studying Sanskrit. He's trying to get a sense of the kinds of peoples who live here. And he seems to be quite aware that there is all sorts of kind of distinct and different approaches that Hindus, even Hindus, have towards, God and so on and so forth, right? By the way, this whole idea of Hinduism as a kind of closed religion, right? That too is a very modern idea. So when the British arrived, right, they try to kind of see Hinduism. They're the ones that you really begin to see this idea of Hinduism, right? Prior to that, people did not describe themselves as Hindu. They described themselves devotees of Krishna. They described themselves as Vaishnava, or any number of various ways of thinking about there are local cults, sects, different approaches to, different deities, different stories. And so there's like a mosaic of what you could call, I mean, Romila Thapar, who is a historian of pre-modern India, she says there is a mosaic of different cults, practices, beliefs, and so to see Hinduism as a one unified religion with a founder and a set of texts, this was an idea that the British thought that they could say, okay, Hinduism is like Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, or Islam and Christianity. Like it has a founder, it had a set of texts. So this was an Abrahamical kind of bias towards this Hinduism. And so, you see people, they go, British officials, they want to find out, they go to South India, they say, They asked Brahmins, what is this? Do you have a book like this? See, they think that everybody has a Bible, right? So they begin to ask the Brahmins. The Brahmins say, "Oh yeah, I guess it's the Gita or this, right?" So there's a whole way in which that kind of approach to the study of history, and also by extension religion, carries with it, right, in the 18th and 19th centuries, particular biases that then come to inform the common sense of even nationalist histories. So even when Nehru begins to write the history, the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, writes this book he writes this book actually while he's in prison in I believe in the Ahmednagar fort. Discovery of India. He writes this book of history, and he too describes Muslims as outsiders, right? I mean, where is Nehru getting this idea from? I mean, he's been trained and educated in British systems of education in which this narrative of history is being now passed down to those who, particularly the English-speaking educated classes of India. So let me pause there, and if you have any questions, I can take questions, or I'm happy to sort of talk more, or I don't know if I'm boring you. I know this is a lot of material.
It's wonderful and enlightening, I'm sure, for everybody. Any questions? Ryan Shasa? No? Anybody online who would like to add something?
Yeah. Yeah.
Huh?
Ali is saying.
Ali, yes. Ali, please.
He has a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for your fascinating talk. Uh, uh, I was wondering about how you started from the Greek word historia,
Yeah.
and you invoked and you sort of. I apologize if this is sort of all over the place. I'm forming this as I'm speaking, uh, and I'm seeing history from a um, different perspective. So you invoked you invoked the Greek word historia and the word investigation, and then you
Mm-hmm.
built on that with the you built on that with the Western conception of history, on how it's written down and agreed upon as objective. I'm wondering about how that might fly in the face of when we are, let's say, arguing with um, the leader of the Hindu party, when we tell them about the historical continuity of Muslims in South India. what what would happen if they were to invoke their own conception of history as a more mythopoetic, uh, as a more storytelling kind of process, or rather than something that's written down and agreed upon? What if they were to invoke their own conception of history as more a collection of myths on or something that is, more a product of the imagination than anything else?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I
How
think
how
that's
would we validate our arguments to that?
Yeah. I think that's an excellent question. I mean, so history is also really fascinating for other reasons, right? Because history is it's something that sits between art, because it's like a craft. You have to craft a narrative, but it also relies on, like, evidence. You actually have to have evidence to make your narrative, right? Now, there's a historian by the name of Niladri Bhattacharya in India, who at some point was based at Jawaharlal Nehru University at JNU, and he's written this wonderful piece called "The Problem," in which he looks at precisely this issue, the ways in which how this sort of the mythos of the Hindu right in sort of making arguments about the permanence of this sort of essential, unchanging Hinduism that was always there. I mean, but he also shows that a lot of those myths actually come out of the Orientalists, the British Orientalists who are writing about India. That's one thing. The second thing I would say is that, it's interesting because the past, on the one hand, the past doesn't come to us with a single one truth embedded in it. The facts that the historians go and develop when they look at archives and materials, they don't speak with one single voice. And of course, as our perspectives change, right, we look to the past in new ways. We reinterpret those events in different ways. We discover new meanings. We pose new questions. So, for example, if you looked at 1857, the revolt of 1857, and now you you just ignore for a long time, right? The way 1857, there was nobody talked about the women who were involved in the revolt of 1857. Right? So now people have begun to think about, oh, there are women who did all sorts of things in 1857 as well. So it gives you this fuller kind of analysis or fuller picture of what's happening, right? I think that the issue here with the rewriting of history, so the issue of rewriting of history is not the problem. But there are some modes of rewriting of history that are obviously like intellectually unacceptable. So when the Hindu right makes claims that Taj Mahal was not a monument built by Shah Jahan, that this was a temple, what evidence are they providing us for that, right? And if you actually look at where those ideas come from, they don't even come from, Hindus living at that time during Shah Jahan. They come from 20th century, fringe conspiracy theory kind of ideas like P and Oak. This was if you look at where this whole idea that Taj Mahal is not is a Hindu temple, this idea comes from a guy named P and Oak. He was an Indian, this is early to mid 20th century. He was just making stuff up, right? I think that one of the ways in which we might want to think about it is that the Hindu right also has a particular and peculiar definition of the kinds of myths it even invokes. So like it's very biased towards upper caste Brahmanical views of those same stories. But if you actually look at the plurality of within the broader kind of pantheon of sort of Hindu deities, gods, goddesses, all of their kind of mythologies, you'll see that the Hindu right selects what is, the most kind of either they're right now, I mean, there's a lot of rewriting of history that Hindutva has been doing over the past, actually, this has been going on for over 25 years now. And that rewriting of history has been going on mostly like in these Shishu Mandirs and these small kinds of educational institutes that have popped up everywhere. And so, I mean, there is something to be said about authority and expertise, about kind of, thinking about history. I'm not saying like nobody can do history unless they have a PhD in history. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there has to be some sense of authority and expertise so that the rewriting of history is one in which you are making intellectually legitimate claims and not just making things up as you go along, or, saying that, I mean, it's also driven by a particular agenda, right? The Hindutva rewriting of history is driven by a particular kind of agenda. They start from the claim, they begin with India as a Hindu nation. So that is where they begin, and then they work backwards. So I guess the question is, let's actually look at that time period. Let's look at who is writing what. Let's actually unpack. There are all sorts of Persian manuscripts, all sorts of things that were being written, responded to. I mean, you see so much of this. You see, I mean, if you read about, there are poets writing in the 1600s saying that Akbar is a reincarnation of Vishnu. There are poets who are making in Tamil Nadu, you see so much of this, who are saying like they talk about Krishna and the prophet in the same poetic lines. So there's a really rich and vibrant, for the majority of South Asian history, there has been a rich and vibrant coexistence between all these different cultural and religious groupings that needs to be invoked and reinvigorated by reading these old poetry, looking at these Persian texts in their original formats, thinking about the way they were rewritten by the British and by Indian nationalists and by also Pakistani nationalists. So when you start from the point of view of this is this country and nobody else here has the right to kind of define it, and this is this exclusive domain. If you see like Pakistani nationalism, right? Oh, only Punjabi, Sunni, this definition of Pakistan is acceptable. If you start there and work backwards, then obviously you've already decided what is your claim before you've proven it, right? So rather than starting there, pick up the materials from, I mean, there's another wonderful writer. Unfortunately, she has also been banned by the Hindu right, Wendy Doniger. I don't know if you know of her work. She's written this book, Hinduism and Alternative, the Hindus and Alternative History, in which she kind of talks about the plurality and the diversity of Hinduism. So, I mean, I would start there. I mean, why does one group get to define the whole? Why do they become the spokespersons? And that too, it's a hate-filled agenda, right?
Great, thank you very much.
So in other words, we can say is that before the British came, the Hindu or the Indian thinking generally was not a polemical, confrontational approach. If they would see Muslims, when somebody will say that I believe in one God and this is my doctrine, they will be like, okay, fine. They would not be challenged by. They would not take it as something like if another Hindu says that he worships like Vishnu or Shiva or whatever, they would not be offended or be challenged by that kind of an attitude. So they would not. The Hindu nationalism itself probably develops, you can say, after the British come. But in contrast to that, Muslims have a sense of a nation. They have a sense of ummah when they're already there. They're coming to the subcontinent. So they have this sense of ambition, or you can say they have something to prove where the locals probably do not think in those similar kind of terms. So it's like what was I going to say?
I just forgot.
So.
But see,
Yeah.
this is the question. I mean, this is interesting because when we say this, then which Muslims and which Hindus are we talking about? Because the idea of ummah is invoked, certainly, but it's not invoked universally across time and space by all Muslims. And we have to also kind of think about which Muslims and who are the Muslims who are in power. And they're not just Muslims, right? I mean, people were not seeing this in terms even of Hindu Muslim in the pre-modern world. They saw this is like Central Asian, Turkic ethnicity, Persian speaking, right? That was the overall kind of view. And so I think, I mean, like I'll give you an example, like this idea of where the whole Mughal emperors, where they think they came from. There's a whole origin story. If you read Abul Fazl's chronicles, he wants to write where the Mughals came from. I mean, what's their family genealogy? And they believe that Babur, how is Babur born? How is Babur's ancestors born, right? So there was a belief that amongst the Mughals, right, that there was a princess, her name was Alankwa, she came from the sun, she was impregnated by the sun, and that's how you begin to see the Mughal genealogy, that she was a virgin. I mean, there was a really rich kind of way of understanding that, I mean, it was not strictly what we would call Islamic doctrine, like in the definition that perhaps you might hear from the ulama, okay? They might not sort of see that as kind of, and I'm not speaking, sorry, even all ulama, they also debate between themselves. So the idea that, you know, Muslims have this like doctrinal one doctrine of ummah itself is like is not a universal, is what I'm saying, right? So of course, I mean, Mughal rulers, even the other pre-modern Muslim rulers, they encountered clearly they're going to be ruling a vast country where the majority of the subjects were not Muslim. So lots of ways in which they were accommodated. Yeah.
One more thing I was wondering, there are two narratives that we can think about when we think about Islam in the subcontinent. One is, of course, where Muhammad bin Qasim or the other Mahmud Ghaznavi, and they're considered like heroes, and they're, you know. But the other side is exactly the opposite when Muhammad bin Qasim comes and he pillages the whole people, and he's not as benevolent as he is portrayed in the Islamic histories, but it's actually exactly the opposite. in similar case, Mahmud Ghaznavi as well, and then there are other, but all the other people who come from the northwest and Muslims as well, from Arabs as well. So these two narratives, how do we reconcile? Which one is more accurate in all these cases? I'm sure if truth lies somewhere in between. In some cases, it probably would be true in one way and the truth other way. So how do we reconcile this?
I would like to ask a complementary question to this. Like what you said, like the British rewriting the history and Hindutva are doing it like for like 20, 25 years. Now that is very modern history that we're talking about. So we can actually testify to that. Adding on to what Mohsin is asking, like I was watching this documentary about Spanish history and Muslim presence in there. And there is a Oxford University historian, Betty Hedges. She claims that the ousting of Muslims in 1492, the Spanish Inquisition, they actually adopted this view that all these Moriscos, the people who came from Morocco, they were outsiders, when actually most of them, in fact, majority of them were actually local converts. They were Spaniards by blood. So that is like medieval history. Now we're talking about like Muhammad bin Qasim and this. So how do we actually reconcile the difference that what narrative we present, what we're presenting, or one entity is presenting that is actually authentic and the other one is false? How do we come upon this from a historical perspective?
So I began this talk by saying that the two things that are important here: colonialism and nationalism, right? So to go back to Mohsin's question about this Muhammad bin Qasim and the Ghaznavids and so on and so forth, right? So like if you understand it from the Pakistani nationalist perspective, he's a hero. If you go on the Indian nationalist perspective, he's zero, right? I mean, like this modality of understanding history as hero versus zero, and seeing this this is part and parcel of the kind of nationalist writing of history, and most of history writing since the 19th century, particularly if you look at Europe, has been national histories, right? So I suppose one way to kind of think outside of these frames is to realize that nations and nationalism are very much a part of the modern kind of way of politically organizing states, and that nations and nationalism as they exist today never existed in the pre-modern past. You didn't have this kind of way of political sovereignty as defined by one people, one language, one state that is absolutist state with its singular kind of values, and so on and so forth, right? So I think that to do this, and there's a wonderful book by Manan Ahmad actually about the Chachnama. It's about actually looking and rereading the Chachnama, which was the earliest text we have, that is a 13th century Persian text that actually narrates Muhammad bin Qasim's arrival to Sindh. So I suppose we would have to think about, again, going to those primary sources, looking and reading at those critically, and not kind of being subsumed by the nationalist narratives of the past. We have to question those narratives. We have to kind of go back and look at primary sources and ask questions. Like, for example, like if you read this beautiful, there's this wonderful kind of, there's a farman at one point that in Akbar's court that is distributed to all of his court officials, how to be an ideal court official. It was written in I believe in the 1570s. And it's like a Dastur al-Amal basically is called, and how to be a good officer, how to be a good administrator. And you read this, it's like an ethical treatise. It's like a manual on how to be a good administrator. And one of the things that is said in there is don't interfere religion. Don't interfere with the customs of the people and the religion of the people. That's not part of what we are doing here, right? So they had an imagination, even though Akbar and all these Mughals thought of themselves as divinely kind of sanctioned, they also had this understanding on a practical realm of how to govern their vast territories around this question of religious difference and religious tolerance. And so I think it's really important to go and look at the primary sources, to read those in Urdu, in Persian, in the languages that you can, and to sort of see, to sort of ask those questions: who wrote this? When did they write it? Why did they write it? What motivated them to write it? Rather than relying all the time on kind of these nationalist narratives that have become part of the common sense. Does that kind of answer your question? I mean, this 7/11 date is just a flash in the pan that doesn't actually talk about, that's not really, oftentimes they say, oh, this is the date, this is when Muslims came to India. I mean, this is a very kind of narrow definition, I think, and much has been made of 7/11 and this, Muhammad bin Qasim and so on. I encourage you to read Manan Ahmed's book on the Chachnama, which is about Muslim origins in South Asia, and also about this business of how these nationalist narratives invoke certain figures for particular reasons, at particular points, and not for like a real genuine curiosity of who these figures were.
That's wonderful, I think, and you've given me an opportunity. I wanted to share a small extract with them from the Chashnama. It's been translated to Urdu. So during the week, inshallah, I'll share with them. Now, Syed Ramiz wanted to ask a question. He's online. Ramiz, you can ask, and then we should head towards wrapping this up. We don't want to stop. It's been very, very engaging. We'll take a couple of more questions, I guess, and then you can conclude. Ramiz?
जी बहुत शुक्रिया. My question sort of what I'm trying to understand is what system of government is ideal in a way that lately the product of democracy, the products of democracy that we got to see in different parts of the world, such as in India, we have a very nationalist kind of a government, and also in the United States, we see a white supremacist inclination. That sort of leads us to rethink what the concept of power should be. When we then try to explore the other forms of government, such as like aristocracy, epistocracy, more centralized forms. But I also was listening to another scholar the other day. He said that when centralization happens, when center becomes more powerful, ethnicity also starts, fluttering its wings. For example, we see that during Aurangzeb's reign, the Mughal Empire became extremely strong. Even during Shah Jahan's reign, it became stronger. So we see, the Marathas trying to bring in some rebellion and some revolt. Obviously, that would not be in the name of religion, but could be in against that extreme centralization that was happening towards the north. So the south groups, the tribes or the people in the south, they started revolting. So what should we do in terms of understanding things, understanding the concept of power? Because I think in my perspective, what I have learned so far, especially when we learn about architecture and other art forms, especially when we study knowledge structures and their epistemes, we see that centralization has a certain importance, and centralization is archetypal, and also we sort of innately structure things based on the ideas of centralization. So how should we approach things, because we have to also take care of other small centers that are out there while we are centralizing ourselves. There are other small centers such as Marathas I talked about earlier. So what do you think about this whole power scenario, how it should be, and what is the ideal, or where should we head to? What should be our approach towards thinking about it and learning about it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your question. I don't know how to answer what is the ideal. I mean, that's a much longer conversation. I can talk about the historical context in South Asia, which is that periods of centralization right, in South Asia, in the pre-modern world, were followed by periods of decentralization. And that empires is actually a very small part of the story in pre-modern India, and I mean this part of the world. The majority of South Asian history is not defined by empires. Majority is defined by all these local dynasties and various kinds of collections of, small political sovereign states and kingdoms, than by centralization. The most centralized state that comes to be is actually not the Mughals, it's the British. They actually are they introduced a kind of level of centralization that was unseen in the sort of pre-modern world. So even the Mughal sort of statecraft, though it became, somewhat centralized, it was more like a diffuse kind of hegemony, right? I mean, so if you look at, for example, this Mansabdari system that Akbar introduces, right? He doesn't have like a huge standing army that's the only thing he's using. Like, I mean, the British introduced the standing army in the 1800s, right? But it becomes one of the largest in the world. But Akbar's forces, for example, like this whole Mansabdari system was a way of actually developing loyalty from these regional states and nobles who would contribute a certain number of foot soldiers, cavalry, any number of military personnel to Akbar as a way of kind of securing land grants, jagirs, and so on, right? So even the Rajputs, right, they were part of this Mansabdari system. Your Mansab literally means rank. And so, depending on your rank, if you are 10, you give 10 soldiers, so on and so forth, right? So this idea, most of South Asian history is not defined actually by highly centralized imperial powers. Most of it is actually decentralized power. And to kind of think about those in-between periods between empires are actually the most interesting periods of history. So if you're looking at ways of thinking more about sort of power and the way it's organized in these ways, I would then look to the parts and periods of history that are not defined by empires. Go to the periods in between empires. 18th century, this is a transition from Mughal to British. That's a very interesting period, even earlier.
Wonderful. I think that this whole session has given us a lot of very, very good background
insights.
So, things that we'll be looking upon during this course generally, especially this first 4 weeks. I think we have to take, with your permission, we should be wrapping up, and
yes,
we'll have one last question from Ryan. A small question.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was very, very interesting. Just a quick question about, you talked about the Indian Ocean world and this, like, the importance of trade, and this kind of cultural difference and religious differences being negotiated. Why was it that the British were so successful in being able to kind of annihilate that narrative? And were people not aware of these links, and how could they perpetuate a vision of history so successfully? Because would it not just ring false in the ears of the people that there was this? How was it possible?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. In that case, you'd have to revisit the late 18th century history to kind of get a sense of the East India Company and the way the East. See, so for the very first time in South Asian history, India gets conquered by a company, not by kings, not by conquerors who are dynasts, by a company. This is very new. It's a company that comes to India and begins to rule and collect taxes, right? So that's one thing I think that's really important to bear in mind. And they're, of course, for them, what's important is the bottom line, is profit. It's not about, the kind of way of renegotiating all of this, sovereignty and so on and so forth. For 100 years, it's the company, East India Company, that rules India. So there is a break. There is a real sort of serious kind of what you could call economic, political, epistemological break with the onset of British colonialism and new regimes of power and economically. And there's lots of really interesting ways. If you look at 1765 in particular, and these battles of Plassey, in which the East India Company wins at Panipat and elsewhere. Battle of Plassey rather. There's one Mughal official by the name of Narayan Singh who actually says this. He says, "What honor is left to us? What honor is left to us that we are now being governed by young boys who have not learned how to wash their bottoms?" He says this, Narayan Singh, in the 1760s, 1770s. Okay, so they are aware. There is an awareness at the level of those who are losing their territories, that something is dramatically changing. So I think it's a history that needs to be explored more. What makes them successful in kind of doing this? But there's other things, right? This introduction of the concept of race, for example, in the 19th century, is a very powerful category. That begins, also the centralization of the state. It's a very, very powerful kind of extractive state, economically speaking, and it's tied up with sort of the rise of modern capitalism. So India's fortunes become tied up with a kind of modern capitalist economy. That was not the case in the pre-modern world. So there's various ways in which why it is that the British do become successful in breaking down these older forms of social relations. They begin to be mediated through much more intensely commercialization, like commercialization of agriculture. Land was never thought of as a movable commodity. Land was never thought in pre-modern India that you can buy a plot and then move it. Land was always sort of thought of as in very different ways, as not a commodity. So this, I think, is a big way in which I think that that plays a role. Economics plays a big role in the way in which that changes.
I think another answer to that, if I can just add, was the global narrative that was shaping place in that time. Nationalism, the rise of nationalism all across the globe because of various colonial powers. So that also helped the British to actually perpetuate that narrative as well.
Absolutely. The British don't become British until they begin to conquer India. They are different. They are Scots. They are Welsh. They're all these different groupings. It's actually the idea of being British as a British nationalism comes about through British imperialism in India. So absolutely, that is that's a key kind of component is the question of nationalism, together with economic forms of through capitalism and so on and so forth, that begins to change this pre-modern notions of difference.
So Rahmeen has just asked for suggestions for some appropriate reading books or something like that, or articles. Or would you like to share that later in an email, which I could then forward?
Later, I can send you a list. I have several references I can provide. So it just depends on what the topic is, and I can definitely send you like a short bibliography.
And I'd like to thank you again for the wonderful session.
And I'm also scheduled, I think, in upcoming weeks to speak at Hast, Neest, right?
Yes, please.
I'm actually coming to Pakistan in next week. Yeah. मैं आ रही हूँ पाकिस्तान आ रही हूँ 28 के दिन, and I'll be there until the 14th of March. I'll mostly be in Karachi, but I think I'll be in Lahore. My husband